I have spent 30 years analyzing alliance politics, coalition stability, and the domestic international feedback loops that determine whether democracies can sustain coherent foreign policy under pressure. I have watched governments fall over far smaller fractures than what is unfolding in Jerusalem right now. Nothing in that experience prepared me for what detonated across the Israeli political system in the 72 hours between March 14th and March 17th. The European Union imposed personal sanctions on Israel's National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, freezing his assets, banning his travel to all 27 member states, and explicitly citing incitement to war crimes as the justification. Within 18 hours, the Netanyahu coalition lost its parliamentary majority. Two parties withdrew confidence. 5 Knesset members announced they would not vote with the government on critical legislation, and the prime minister is now governing a minority administration, while his own cabinet publicly fractures over whether to escalate or de-escalate with Brussels, Tehran, and Washington simultaneously. Let me be precise about the sequence. On March 14th, European Union foreign ministers met an emergency session in Brussels to discuss what the official communiqué called credible evidence of systematic incitement to violence against civilian populations by senior members of the Israeli government. The evidence cited included public statements by National Security Minister Ben-Gvir calling for the total displacement of Palestinian populations from the West Bank, the expansion of Israeli settlements into areas designated under international law as occupied territory, and the arming of civilian militias in defiance of military chain-of-command protocols. At 14:20 Central European Time, the EU Council announced a package of targeted sanctions against Ben-Gvir personally, including asset freezes, travel bans, and restrictions on any European entities doing business with companies he controls or benefits from. This is not symbolic. This is the European Union treating a sitting cabinet minister of a close ally the same way it treats sanctioned Russian oligarchs and Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders. And the political earthquake inside Israel was immediate. I want to be honest with you about something. My first reaction when I read the EU sanctions announcement was not surprise. It was recognition that European patience with the current Israeli government had finally run out. Ben-Gvir is not a fringe figure. He is the head of the Otzma Yehudit party, a critical coalition partner that gives Netanyahu the votes he needs to govern. He controls the Israeli National Police. He has direct influence over settlement policy and law enforcement in the West Bank. And he has spent the last 18 months making public statements that European governments consider incitement to ethnic cleansing. Brussels did not wake up one morning and decide to sanction a close ally's cabinet minister. This was the culmination of months of warnings, private diplomacy, and failed attempts to get Netanyahu to rein in his coalition partners. In the next 40 minutes, I'm going to walk you through 4 questions that define this crisis. First, why did the European Union decide to impose personal sanctions on Ben-Gvir now? What evidence triggered the decision? And what does the legal basis tell us about European strategy going forward? Second, how has the Israeli government responded? Why is the coalition fracturing? And what does the parliamentary arithmetic tell us about Netanyahu's ability to survive? Third, what are the broader implications for Israeli-European relations, for transatlantic coordination, and for the credibility of Western unity on Middle East policy? And fourth, what does this crisis reveal about the deeper contradiction between Israel's domestic politics and its international legitimacy in an era where coalition governments depend on far-right partners whose rhetoric alienates the very allies Israel depends on? If this is the kind of analysis you have been looking for, the kind that does not pick sides but counts votes and tracks consequences, subscribe and stay with me. Hit like, drop your assessment in the comments. I read them. This is not commentary. This is a breakdown of power, coalition math, and the mechanics of how democracies fracture under external pressure. Phase 1 is the European legal and strategic framework. The EU sanctions were imposed under the European Union Global Human Rights Sanctions regime, the same mechanism used to sanction Russian officials involved in the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, Chinese officials involved in abuses in Xinjiang, and Myanmar military leaders involved in the Rohingya crisis. The threshold for these sanctions is not criminal conviction. It is credible evidence of serious human rights violations, including incitement to such violations, complicity in violations, or command responsibility over forces that commit violations. The European Foreign Affairs Council cited 3 categories of evidence in the Ben-Gvir case. First, a series of public statements dating back to January 2025, in which Ben-Gvir explicitly called for the forcible transfer of Palestinian populations from Area C of the West Bank to make room for expanded Israeli settlements. Under international humanitarian law, forcible transfer of populations in occupied territory is classified as a grave breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention. Second, Ben-Gvir's authorization of the arming of civilian settlement security teams in defiance of Israeli Defense Forces protocols, which European governments argue creates the conditions for extrajudicial violence against Palestinian civilians. Third, Ben-Gvir's public endorsement of demolitions of Palestinian homes and infrastructure without due process, which the EU considers collective punishment prohibited under international law. Now here is what that legal framework tells you. The EU is not sanctioning Ben-Gvir for being right-wing or nationalist. It is sanctioning him for specific actions and statements that Brussels has determined meet the threshold of incitement to violations of international humanitarian law. That is a high bar. And the fact that the EU crossed it tells you that European governments are no longer willing to treat Israeli coalition politics as an internal matter when those politics produce policy outcomes that violate norms Europe considers foundational. Let me tell you something the mainstream will not tell you. This is not about Palestine. This is about the rules-based international order that European governments believe they have a stake in defending. If the EU allows a close ally to incite forced population transfers, demolish civilian infrastructure, and arm militias outside military command structures without consequences, then the entire framework of international humanitarian law becomes unenforceable. That is the strategic calculation driving Brussels. It is not anti-Israel. It is pro-framework. And Israel's current government is testing whether that framework still has teeth. Phase 2 is the Israeli domestic political response, and this is where the story becomes a masterclass in coalition fragility. Netanyahu's coalition depends on 64 seats in the 120-seat Knesset. A majority requires 61. The coalition is composed of Likud, Netanyahu's party, with 32 seats, Shas and United Torah Judaism, the ultra-Orthodox parties with 18 seats combined, Religious Zionism with 7 seats, and Otzma Yehudit, Ben-Gvir's party, with 6 seats. One additional right-wing party, Yisrael Beitenu, provides support on specific votes but is not formally in the coalition. Within 18 hours of the EU sanctions announcement, two things happened. First, Benny Gantz, who leads the National Unity Party and had been providing outside confidence support to the government on security matters, announced that his party would no longer support the coalition on any vote unless Netanyahu removed Ben-Gvir from the cabinet. Gantz has 8 seats. Second, 5 members of Likud, Netanyahu's own party, publicly stated that they would not vote for any legislation that expanded settlement activity or weakened Israeli coordination with international humanitarian organizations. Those 5 votes do not constitute a formal defection, but they represent a warning that the moderate wing of Likud is prepared to break ranks if Netanyahu continues to accommodate Ben-Gvir. Do the math. Netanyahu currently has 64 seats. If Gantz withdraws support, Netanyahu drops to 56. If the 5 Likud moderates defect on key votes, Netanyahu cannot pass legislation. He cannot pass budgets. He cannot sustain coalition discipline. That means the government is effectively paralyzed unless Netanyahu either expels Ben-Gvir from the coalition or convinces the EU to reverse the sanctions. Neither option is politically viable. Here is why. If Netanyahu expels Ben-Gvir, Otzma Yehudit withdraws its 6 seats, the coalition drops to 58 and the government falls. New elections would likely produce a coalition led by Gantz or Yair Lapid, centrist figures who have committed to reversing many of Netanyahu's policies. Netanyahu would lose power. He is also facing ongoing corruption trials, and losing power means losing the political leverage he has used to delay those proceedings. So from Netanyahu's perspective, expelling Ben-Gvir is political suicide. But if Netanyahu refuses to expel Ben-Gvir, the Likud moderates have an incentive to defect. The EU sanctions remain in place, and Israel faces the prospect of additional European measures, including restrictions on trade, scientific cooperation, and security coordination. That is also politically unsustainable because it threatens the economic and diplomatic foundation of Israel's relationship with its second largest trading partner after the United States. That is the parliamentary trap Netanyahu is in. He cannot move forward. He cannot move backward. And every day the crisis continues, his coalition loses credibility, support, and coherence. Stay with me. What comes next is where this gets even more complicated. Phase 3 is the international dimension, and this is where the crisis transcends Israeli domestic politics and becomes a stress test of the entire Western alliance structure. The United States, under President Trump, has been Israel's most reliable defender on the international stage. Trump moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, and withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, in part to align with Israeli security priorities. But the EU sanctions on Ben-Gvir are forcing Washington into a choice it would prefer to avoid. Option 1, the United States could publicly condemn the EU sanctions, argue that they undermine Israeli sovereignty, and pressure Brussels to reverse course. That would align Washington with Netanyahu, but at the cost of a major rift with Europe. Option 2, the United States could privately encourage Netanyahu to remove Ben-Gvir while publicly calling for de-escalation on all sides. That would preserve transatlantic unity but weaken Trump's relationship with Netanyahu and alienate the pro-Israel constituencies Trump depends on domestically. Option 3, the United States could stay silent, allow the crisis to play out, and avoid taking a position. That would preserve flexibility but signal to both Israel and Europe that American leadership on Middle East policy is functionally absent. As of March 18th, Washington has chosen option 3. The State Department issued a bland statement calling for dialogue and restraint. The White House has made no comment, and Trump himself has not mentioned the crisis publicly. That silence is not neutrality. It is paralysis, and both Jerusalem and Brussels are reading it as evidence that the United States no longer has the political will or strategic coherence to manage alliance conflicts in the Middle East. Let me be direct about what that means. The transatlantic alliance is supposed to function as a unified bloc on security, trade, and international governance. When the EU and Israel are in direct conflict and the United States refuses to mediate, the alliance is not unified. It is fractured, and every adversary watching, whether in Moscow, Beijing, or Tehran, is taking notes. Before we go further, you need to understand the economic dimension of this crisis. The European Union is Israel's largest trading partner after the United States, accounting for approximately 30% of Israeli exports and 25% of imports. Trade between Israel and the EU totaled over $40 billion in 2025. That includes not just goods, but services, technology licensing, scientific cooperation, and defense procurement. The EU sanctions on Ben-Gvir are personal, not economic, but they are also a warning. If Israel continues on its current trajectory, those personal sanctions could expand into sectoral sanctions targeting settlement products, arms sales, or even financial services. Israel is already facing boycott movements from civil society organizations across Europe. The Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement, BDS, has gained traction in European universities, trade unions, and local governments, despite being opposed by most European national governments. If the EU itself begins to impose economic restrictions, that legitimizes the BDS framework and accelerates economic decoupling between Israel and Europe. That would cost Israel billions in trade, access to European research funding, and the diplomatic cover that comes from being integrated into European economic networks. Now do the arithmetic from Netanyahu's perspective. He cannot afford to lose Europe economically, but he also cannot afford to lose Ben-Gvir politically, so he is trying to thread a needle that does not exist, issuing statements that condemn the EU sanctions while promising to investigate the evidence, defending Ben-Gvir while distancing himself from the most incendiary rhetoric, and hoping that time and diplomacy will resolve a crisis that is fundamentally about irreconcilable values. I want to tell you something I do not think enough analysts are saying clearly. This crisis is not about one minister or one set of sanctions. It is about the structural contradiction at the heart of Israeli politics in 2026. Israel is a democracy that depends on coalition governments. Coalition governments in Israel increasingly depend on far-right parties whose base demands policies that alienate Israel's international allies. Those policies, whether settlement expansion, annexation rhetoric, or incitement against Palestinian populations, produce diplomatic isolation, economic costs, and security risks that undermine the very goals the far right claims to support. That is the vicious cycle. The more Netanyahu accommodates his far-right partners to stay in power, the more isolated Israel becomes internationally. The more isolated Israel becomes, the more its security environment deteriorates. The more the security environment deteriorates, the more the far right can claim that international pressure proves the world is against Israel and that only they can be trusted to defend it. And the cycle continues. Phase 4 is the global precedent, and this is where the crisis has implications far beyond Israel. The EU sanctions on Ben-Gvir are the first time a major Western alliance bloc has imposed personal sanctions on a sitting cabinet minister of a close democratic ally. That is a significant escalation in how Europe is willing to use sanctions as a foreign policy tool. And it sets a precedent that could be applied to other allies whose domestic politics produce outcomes Europe considers unacceptable. Think about the implications. If the EU can sanction an Israeli minister for incitement to forced population transfers, can it sanction a Hungarian minister for policies Europe considers violations of rule of law standards? Can it sanction an American official if a future U.S. administration pursues policies Europe considers violations of international law? The legal framework is now in place, the precedent has been set, and every government that depends on coalition partners with extreme positions is watching to see whether those sanctions are sustainable or whether Israel can force Brussels to back down. In Moscow, the Kremlin is watching with barely concealed satisfaction. Russia has been arguing for years that Western governments apply international law selectively, condemning adversaries while protecting allies. The EU sanctions on Ben-Gvir undermine that narrative slightly, because they show Europe is willing to sanction allies. But they also validate the broader Russian argument that international law is a tool of power politics, not a neutral framework. If the EU can sanction Israeli officials for settlement policy, why can Russia not argue that its actions in Ukraine are equally justified under competing interpretations of international law? The answer is that they are not equivalent, but the perception of equivalence is what matters in global narrative competition. In Beijing, the response has been more measured but equally strategic. China has been building relationships with Middle Eastern states by positioning itself as a neutral broker that does not impose values-based conditions on its partnerships. The EU sanctions on Ben-Gvir reinforce the Chinese narrative that Western alliances are unstable, values-driven, and prone to internal conflict. That makes China's transactional, non-ideological approach more attractive to states that want economic partnership without political lectures. For the Gulf states, the crisis is a reminder that alliance with the West comes with strings attached. If the EU is willing to sanction an Israeli cabinet minister, it is certainly willing to pressure Gulf monarchies on human rights, governance, or regional policy. That makes diversification of partnerships, whether with China, Russia, or even Iran, a rational hedge against Western conditionality. And for the broader developing world, the message is clear. International law is enforced selectively, alliances are conditional, and sovereignty is not absolute if your policies offend the values of more powerful states. That is not an argument for moral relativism. It is a description of how power works in a multipolar world where norms are contested and frameworks are politicized. Let me come back to one more dimension of this crisis that deserves attention: the human cost. When we talk about coalition math and sanctions regimes and alliance fractures, it is easy to forget the people living inside this crisis. There are Palestinian families in the West Bank who have been living under policies that Ben-Gvir has advocated for, including home demolitions, restricted movement, and the expansion of armed settler militias. There are Israeli families who depend on their government to maintain international legitimacy and economic access, both of which are now at risk because of coalition politics they may not support. There are European diplomats who have spent years trying to preserve the transatlantic alliance and who are now watching it fracture over a crisis that was entirely predictable and entirely avoidable. I have served in environments where political decisions made thousands of miles away determined whether the people I was responsible for would be safe or at risk. I know what it feels like to watch policy debates play out in capitals while the consequences are borne by people who have no voice in those debates. And I know that the crisis unfolding in Jerusalem and Brussels right now will ultimately be paid for by people who never voted for Ben-Gvir, never sanctioned him, and never had the power to prevent any of this. Let me be direct with you. The question facing Israel right now is not whether Ben-Gvir should resign or be expelled. The question is whether Israel can sustain a governing model that depends on coalition partners whose policies make the country ungovernable internationally. And the answer, based on everything I have seen in the last 72 hours, is no. Israel cannot maintain its alliance relationships, its economic integration, and its international legitimacy while pursuing policies that the rest of the democratic world considers violations of foundational norms. That does not mean Israel has to accept every European demand or abandon its security priorities. It means Israel has to choose between governing coalitions that can sustain international support and governing coalitions that cannot. Netanyahu is trying to have both. And the crisis we are watching is the inevitable consequence of that contradiction. The question I want to leave you with is this: can any democracy sustain coherent foreign policy when its governing coalition depends on partners whose base demands policies that alienate the country's most important allies? Or are we watching a case study in how coalition politics can make a state ungovernable in a globalized world? Leave your assessment in the comments. I read every one. If this analysis delivered the clarity you were not getting from partisan cheerleading or simplistic narratives, share it, hit like, subscribe. The next update is already in preparation. I will see you in the next.